This meeting has begun.
Great. Thank you very much for that introduction there, Alex. I'm really excited to be talking about restorative justice. In fact, someone who practices restorative justice in a residence hall, I consider myself a bit of a missionary for the cause because I've seen how well it can work, and how effective it is at helping our students out. Before we get going, there is a couple of acknowledgements. So the University of Alberta Resident Services uses restorative justice as our primary method of dealing with student conduct, and none of that would have been possible, not the development of our program, not the development of this training or other training that we do without the help of David Karp and Duke Fisher, who are sort of gurus of restorative justice in the United States. I'd also like to give a shout out to Deb Airkeys and Chris Hackett from the Office of Student Accountability here at the U of A. They work tirelessly in promoting restorative justice within our institution, and a lot of the work goes to the credit of those two people who've been fantastic champions for our programs. And there have been many others who've worked with us. They've trained with us, they've promoted this idea, and they developed policy for the University of Alberta and other institutions. So I'd like to just generally thank everyone who's worked with us in the past. So the voice on your speakers, that's me. My name is Craig, as Alex said, and I've got about 5 years experience working with restorative justice in a residence environment. That's about how long we've been trying restorative justice here at the U of A. I am a member of our Restorative Justice Facilitator Training team here at the University of Alberta, and that's myself, Chris, Deb, and a couple of other staff members. And we do everything that needs to be done around training our staff as well as external members of the community and other institutions and that kind of thing on how to facilitate restorative conferences and how to use restorative justice to address behavior. Our focus is obviously on addressing student behavior, but the practices we use are applicable in other restorative contexts as well. And of course, as Alex mentioned, I'm really proud to be your NWACUHO president, which is why that flattering selfie of the rain stick was included for a little bit of visual stimulation. So the outcomes of this session, because we wouldn't be good student affairs professionals if we're not talking about outcomes, is I want you to understand the basics of how restorative justice works. Missing a word on the PowerPoint, and I apologize for that. But I also want you to understand how restorative justice can be applied in a residence context, and I want to give you a few resources for further learning. So restorative justice is an exceptionally complex topic, and there are a lot of ins and outs that we're not going to be able to get into in the next hour. But what I'm hoping is that this will whet your appetite and you'll understand the basics of how it goes together, and how we can apply it in our work so that you can look at further options. This is a quote that I think is really applicable when it comes to restorative justice. It's an ancient idea whose time has come. If we look through the literature and we look at the history of restorative justice, this is a method of justice that's been used literally throughout history. We see it in a lot of indigenous cultures. We see it all over the world in a variety of contexts. And there's sort of a natural fit. Our natural understanding of what justice is sort of fits with the concepts of restorative justice, and we'll explain why in a couple of minutes. So what is restorative justice? At its core, restorative justice is really a process that addresses harmful behavior, and it does so just the same way, in a lot of ways, the same as other methods of justice would. It's all about addressing harmful behaviors by an individual or a group of individuals where there's a victim involved. We hold offenders accountable for their actions by having them accept and acknowledge responsibility for what they did. We have them repair the harm that they've caused to a person or a community, and we rebuild trust between the perpetrator and the victim of whatever infraction or crime has been committed. So those are really the three goals of restorative justice. Now, that probably sounds familiar, and you're probably thinking to yourself, oh yeah, I do that all the time in my work. But there is usually some confusion with restorative justice, so we're going to work on highlighting what restorative justice isn't, and once we understand that, it'll be a lot more clear what restorative justice is. So let's talk a little bit about the punitive approach for this handsome judge staring down his nose at us. So the punitive approach uses a very legalistic framework. It's all about a very specific rule that was broken with a specific penalty. It focuses on the facts, so who did what, to whom, and when, and those facts need to be backed up usually by evidence. It's entirely focused on an objective judgment of a perpetrator. What that means is that usually a neutral third party, such as a judge or a third party like a jury, makes a decision if someone is guilty or not, and then that decision is delivered in terms of what the penalty will be without the involvement of a victim or a survivor of a crime. So sometimes in the punitive approach, we will see survivor impact statements or victim impact statements, but those aren't always taken into account, and that's really at the leeway of the court, or in our context, at the leeway of the conduct officer. More often than not, the decision is delivered objectively by a third party. There also is a demand in the punitive approach for consistency in outcomes. So if little Timmy breaks a window and is charged $500 and does a week of community service, we can't have like little Susie break the same window 2 weeks later and give her a drastically different penalty, because that doesn't necessarily fit with the legalistic framework. The goal of the punitive approach is, of course, to determine guilt and punish perpetrators appropriately and, as I said, consistently. The developmental approach is another approach to conduct that I'm sure you're a lot more familiar with. And it's more of a collaborative process between the perpetrator and someone someone who holds them accountable. So that's typically an authority figure, again, like a police officer, a judge, or in our context, a conduct officer, resident director, depending again on your environment. The primary focus here is still on determining guilt. Intent does sometimes enter the conversation. So maybe little Timmy didn't mean to break the window. It was an accident. He tripped and he fell. So we would consider that in the developmental approach. The decision is still delivered without typically involving the victim. So again, this is a two-party process between an authority figure and a perpetrator, but the goal is a little bit different than the punitive approach. So instead of trying to find out if they're guilty or not and determine a punishment, the goal is to educate the perpetrator so they understand that the behavior is unacceptable and they don't repeat the behavior again in the future. So again, it's about education of the perpetrator, not necessarily discouraging them to engage not necessarily to punish them. I'm sorry, there we go. So the restorative justice approach, and this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. It's a facilitated process between the perpetrator, in the context of restorative justice, that person's referred to as the responsible party, and the victim, which is called the harm party. So you have three people involved in the restorative process at least. You've got a facilitator, you've got a harm party, and you've got a responsible party. The focus is on storytelling, taking responsibility for actions, and identifying harms that were caused that can now be repaired. The goal is to build some level of trust between both the responsible party and the harm party so that the community can continue to exist. So a lot of folks might think that they do restorative justice in their work, but it's critically important that we have that survivor represented or that harm party involved in the conversation. If the harm party isn't involved, it's not restorative justice, it's developmental as a general rule. Now, when we say harm party, and we'll get into this a little bit later on, we'll define exactly what that looks like so we understand that, sometimes you'll have someone that advocates on behalf of a harm party, but we're not coaching someone through a process to take responsibility and identify harms. They really need to do that on their own when it comes to working with the responsible party. If you're coaching them through it, it's more of a developmental thing. If they're taking responsibility and wanting to make amends and engaging the harm party, that's more likely to be a restorative outcome. So let's use the Great Cadbury Caper as an example. This is an activity we do in our RJ Facilitator Training course, and it sort of highlights the difference between these three approaches. So let's say you're a kid. You're like 6 years old, and you're with your mom at the grocery store, and you're minding your business, and she's doing her shopping, and she's got all of her stuff on the cart and on the little thing, the little conveyor belt that it's on its way out. And of course, what do they have right next to the conveyor belt at every grocery store in the world? They have all the candy. And as a kid, you might be like 4, 5, 6 years old. You know that you really like candy, but you don't really have an enhanced developmental idea of the difference between right and wrong. In fact, you might not get that until you're like 18, and you might not even get it till you're 25, depending on where you live. So let's just say you're that kid, and you're having a tough time. You don't understand that stealing is wrong. But that delicious candy bar is there right in front of you. So you grab that candy bar and you put it in your pocket thinking like, well, I get a candy bar at home all the time. How is this any different? You didn't mean to steal, but you don't even know what that means. Your mom tosses you in the back of the minivan and she drives along, and the next thing you know, she looks in her rearview mirror and she sees chocolate smeared all over your face, and she's thinking back to her grocery purchases, and she knows that she did not buy you a chocolate bar. So she knows that you stole it. She knows you did something wrong. How is this going to be addressed? Well, let's talk about it in the punitive system. Your mom has now realized that she is in the car with a felon, and she's probably very nervous. So what she's going to do is she's going to calmly pull over to the side of the road, and she's going to call the police. The police are going to respond, and they're going to detain you because you committed a crime. I mean, you're a criminal now. You've stolen a candy bar. So you're going to be tossed in a holding cell. You're going to sit in that holding cell until you can get to a court, and you're going to have a lawyer defend you. But of course, there's going to be evidence because there's security cameras all over the convenience store, the grocery store, and they saw you take that and put it in your pocket. And theft has a very specific outcome and a very specific penalty that goes with it. So you're in court, and your public defender is trying to make a case for you, but you know what? Their heart's not really in it. They got other stuff going on, and they're not really paying attention. They mean well, but they're like, this kid's a criminal. That's what they are. We're not going to do it. So you end up with a guilty plea. You're not involved in the sentencing, and you end up spending the next 25 years of your life in jail and become another member of the prison industrial complex. Okay, and as Catherine just said, that escalated quickly, but that's an example of the punitive system in action. Obviously, we're not going to do that to a kid with a candy bar. I'm using an extreme example just to illustrate the differences of these processes. So let's go back to that kid in that corner shop, and they're buying their groceries, and they steal the candy bar exactly the same as before, and the mom's in the minivan, sees the chocolate on your face, and knows that you stole it. This is the developmental approach. Oh, I'm sorry, my animations didn't quite work. The developmental approach, though, is your mom pulls over, she turns around and says, "Where'd you get that candy bar?" And you say to her, "Oh, I grabbed it off the shelf." And she explains the concept of stealing to you. You realize that it's stealing, and you get a bit of a scolding from your mom, and she says, "Don't do that again, it's wrong." You immediately get it, and you go on to be successful because you become the President of the United States. So that escalated quickly as well. A developmental approach is not bad. If that's what you're doing right now, it's probably better than the punitive approach. The developmental approach is shown in the literature to be advantageous for our students. So that's a little word on the developmental approach. Oh, now it's animating. There we go. So now let's go back to that shop, and we'll talk a little bit about what would happen in a restorative approach. This is probably what you're way more familiar with. So the restorative justice approach, your mom notices that you've got the candy bar in the back of the minivan. She turns that van right around. She drives back to the store. She grabs you by the ear and she walks you in and she introduces you to the shopkeeper and she says, "What do you have to say for yourself?" And then you say, "Mr. Shopkeeper, I'm sorry, but I took a candy bar without asking." And he says, "You know what, son, that's stealing. You shouldn't do that." And you say, "I'm so sorry. How can I make that right?" And he says, "Well, the candy bar is $1.95. And so your mom pays him $1.95. And then she says, "What else do you have to say?" And you say to the shopkeeper, "I am really sorry for stealing that candy bar." Lo and behold, you've done restorative justice in a nutshell. I'm sure that's naturally where our instincts were at and where we thought this was going to go. And I'm sure some of us have probably even had this experience. So you've apologized to the shopkeeper. He's forgiven you. You go back when you're 14 years old and he gives you your first job. You become real good friends with the shopkeeper, and then he retires and he gives you the store and you become wealthy and successful, and your name is like Galen Weston or something like that, who owns a Canadian supermarket chain. So restorative justice works best. So in the spectrum, we're talking punitive, sometimes necessary, not so great. We're talking developmental. If that's what you're doing, good job. Restorative means everyone gets whole again. The shopkeeper gets what he needs, you get to learn out of it, and people trust each other and the community is made whole. So those are the differences that I hopefully will help you illustrate the difference between restorative justice, punitive, and developmental. Again, the restorative approach is all about taking responsibility. It's all about repairing the harm. So for instance, pay for the now eaten chocolate bar, because you can't just give them the chocolate bar back after you stuffed your face in the minivan. But it's also about rebuilding trust. And that apology to the shopkeeper, that shopkeeper now trusts that kid not to steal another candy bar. The kid recognizes that what he did was wrong and isn't going to steal from that shopkeeper again. So how does it work in residence? Because that's really what we're all here to say, to learn about rather. The photo on the right-hand side is actually Ackerman Hall. And when I was putting this presentation together, I decided to pluck a residence hall from our region for the visual stuff, and it just so happens to be designed by one of our corporate members. So I was pretty excited to stumble across that in my Google image search. A quote from Gary Pavella I thought is pretty resonates with me a great deal when we're talking about student conduct, and it's that student conduct officers are not employed to find new and more efficient ways to dismiss students. One of our primary roles is recognizing that dismissals are sometimes necessary, but we want to help students who commit disciplinary offenses make amends and stay enrolled. The reason we want them to make amends and stay enrolled, or in the context of a residence hall, we want them to make amends and stay in the community, is because we know there are benefits to living in that community. We know there are benefits to their GPA. We know there's benefits to their feelings of isolation. We know that they'll be more successful as students, and we know that they'll be more successful as fully fledged adults in the real world, because they'll have social skills and those informal lessons that they learn in a residence hall. We're not in the business of evicting people or finding new ways to evict people. We are in the business of making sure students persist in our halls through to graduation, or at least through to the end of their contracts. So how do we use restorative justice in a residence hall? And I'm sure that's what many of you here are here to learn. And the honest answer is that it's very complex. It's too complex to cover in the time that we have here today. And again, this is a very basic overview. To put it into sort of a matter of perspective, we actually spend about a week of electronic online training and then 3 days of in-person training for our facilitator training. And our assessments show that after our staff members go through our facilitator training once, they feel kind of okay about the concepts and the practice, but it takes them a long time to really become comfortable with the role and become comfortable as facilitators. So again, this is a very complex process, and it takes a lot of work to really get it right and become proficient at it. So before you even get to the point of talking about restorative justice, you need to assess the case. All restorative justice is voluntary. And when I say it's voluntary, I mean we can't coerce or force someone to participate in a restorative conference or a restorative process. You need to be able to clearly identify who the harm party is and who the responsible party is, and you need to make sure that both of them are willing to participate in the restorative process. That means you need to explain the process from the point of view of both, conceptually what it means, but also from the point of view of policy. So don't forget, this is still a conduct process, and it is about holding students accountable. And there is, documentation, there are steps they must take, and if they don't follow through with those steps, there are consequences to the students who are the responsible parties. So we want to make sure that we fully understand the process and that our students fully understand the process before we even go near it, and that they have fully informed consent before they agree to participate. You also have to be aware of the complexity of the case and the potential risk of further harm. So one of the things that we're talking a lot about in the restorative justice world is whether or not we can use restorative justice in cases of sexual violence. And while there are a lot of cases where it might be appropriate, where you have a survivor of sexual violence and a perpetrator of sexual violence, whether that's sexual misconduct or sexual assault or whatever the case may be. And a lot of the times what we hear from survivors is a language that they just want to know why. They want to figure out why it happened to them and why they were forced to have that awful experience. On the flip side, for a lot of the more minor cases on the perpetrator side, is there's a genuine lack of understanding, and when they finally realize what they did was wrong, there's all sorts of, I feel guilty, can I apologize, how can I make this right? And I mean, there's a whole bunch of conversations around consent education that we need to have starting way earlier than when they get to our halls. But the problem with using restorative justice in a complex case like a sexual assault or sexual misconduct is that there's a very clear power dynamic there. You need to be extremely careful at exposing someone to a restorative conference, in other words, putting them in a room with the person who harmed them, if there's a risk of creating further trauma. And so you want to be very, very aware of that, and you have to be extremely careful not to tread there. So we've been doing restorative justice at the U of A for 5 years. We're pretty self-aware when it comes to our skills as facilitators, and we've done a lot of conferences that have gone really, really successfully. We still don't feel confident that we can handle a sexual assault or sexual misconduct case. When they come up, we always ask, like, would this work? But we still don't feel confident in our skills as facilitators to be able to pull that off, because again, that risk of further harm is a real one that you need to consider. So don't be finishing up this session with me and then running off and using restorative justice on your students in all these different cases, because it is a super complex thing. And then the final thing is, are people taking responsibility? So more often than not, what we have is we have a clearly identifiable harm party and a clearly identifiable responsible party, and the responsible party needs to be taking responsibility for their actions that they committed, but they're saying that they've also been harmed by the harm party in some way. So we need everybody involved to take responsibility. I'll give you an example of that. A roommate conflict. One roommate borrows another roommate's shirt, and it results in a restorative conference, and we're sitting down with them for what we call a pre-conference, so that's the pre-assessment phase. The person who took the shirt says, well, I only took her shirt because she keeps using my hairbrush. Well, now all of a sudden we've uncovered another case that we need to address, and we need to go back to the harm party and say, hey, they only took your shirt because you keep borrowing their stuff. Is that, like, how do you feel about that? Do you admit that you are responsible for doing that? Because if we don't address that kind of stuff, the restorative justice piece won't work. If we're only addressing half the problem will persist into the future. So again, we want to make sure people are taking responsibility. That being said, when I say that, it can get to be very, very big, where you've got, well, I only did this because they did this, and back and forth, time and time again. But the key thing to keep in mind is that we have very clear limits in a conduct process of what we're dealing with. So for instance, borrowing a shirt without asking, that's essentially stealing, and that would be a conduct process. But if she says something like, well, I only borrowed her shirt because she looked at me funny the other day in the hallway, it's like, well, I don't know if looking at you funny in the hallway is necessarily a conduct violation, so we might not be able to address that restoratively. We would definitely use restorative tools, but it wouldn't necessarily be part of the conduct process. So the restorative process uses the world's greatest acronym, and this acronym was created by a fellow named Neil Bedell, and he's a dean of students at, I want to say, and it escapes me. It's a college in Southern Ontario, and he's a fantastic man and a great restorative justice facilitator. And he decided to settle on the acronym of SHAE because it's easy to remember, because restorative justice is smooth like butter, shea butter. And when I said it was the greatest acronym in the world, I was leaning a little bit tongue-in-cheek. We make fun of it all the time, but to be honest with you, I'll never forget it, so it works really, really well. So SHAE basically stands for 4 different things. The first thing is storytelling, the second thing is harm identification, the third thing is exploring repairs, and the fourth thing is agreement. So these are the steps of any restorative justice process. It doesn't matter if it's an informal one-on-one conversation or if it's an extremely complex circle with like 15 people involved. I'll also mention now, when we're talking about restorative circles, because you probably heard that term before, restorative justice is very aware of power dynamics. I mentioned earlier on that you have to be careful what cases you use, because you don't want to cause further harm by ignoring those power dynamics. One of those ways we deal with that is we use the restorative circle. So restorative circle is exactly what it sounds like. It's when we get the harm parties and the responsible parties in a room, and we sit them in a circle, and they're sometimes next to each other, sometimes across from each other, but the circle is very intentionally designed to address some of those power dynamics that we've observed in the past. That will also be, the other people in the circle will be the facilitators of the restorative conversation. So the key thing with restorative justice is your facilitators are not neutral. They're not sitting there, sitting back like a judge would, listening to sides and all those kinds of things. A restorative facilitator is a multi-partial facilitator. What that means is that when I'm facilitating a restorative conference, sometimes I'm going to be asking some challenging questions or some probing questions to the responsible party that seem like I'm on the harm party side. Other times I'll be doing the exact opposite, where I'm asking challenging questions or probing questions of the harm party, and it'll seem like I'm on the responsible party side. In order to do that effectively, before you get to any restorative process, you need to do what's called a pre-conference. So a pre-conference is where you sit down with the groups involved separately, and you basically ask them all the questions that we're going to ask them when we get them together in a group. By asking them ahead of time, you get the information that you need, you get some sense of what harms are out there, you have some sense of what would repair those harms for them, and you have some sense on whether or not they would agree to those harms. So you want to do your pre-work and your pre-conference work so you sort of know where everybody is at before you get into the actual circle, so that you can properly play that restorative justice facilitator as a multi-partial facilitator. The reason that is so important is because in the pre-conference, they might tell you that, well, they did this, it affected me in the following 3 ways, and this is what I want to fix it. When you get to the actual circle, they might say, when you did this, it affected me in the following 1 way, and this is what you need to do to fix it. And as a facilitator, you have to say, hang on, are you sure there's no other way that this affected you? Because if they don't get that out in the conference, it won't be addressed through the repairs, and then this is going to be like a lingering thing, and they won't be able to restore trust and rejoin the community in the way that we need them to. So again, it's really, really important to do that pre-conference following this same model. Let's talk about each of those steps of the Shea Butter acronym. The first one is being storytelling. Something important to keep in mind is that storytelling is not about the facts. Storytelling in the context of restorative justice is about telling your experience. It's about talking about how you felt, what happened, how did you feel when you found out about what happened, and what have you thought about since. The reason we say it's not about the facts is that this isn't about objectively proving something to be true to a neutral third party. This is about, again, people taking responsibility for their actions, finding ways to repair those harms, and committing to following through with those repairs and building that trust. If you read any research on eyewitness accounts through police services or whatever the case may be, you'll know that you can have 6 people watch the exact same car accident and have 6 different ideas on what happened. We may never be able to, and this is a quote, unfortunately, I can't remember who originally said it, we may never be able to fully agree on what happened, but our hope is that we can come to some level of agreement on the harms that the incident caused and a way to repair those harms and move forward. So that's a key function of this storytelling piece. The next part is identifying the harms. Now, when we talk about harms, there's really only 3 types that we consider because virtually every harm we've come across tends to fall into one of these 3 categories. The first harm is a material harm. That's the ripped up sweater or the broken laptop or the smashed window or whatever the case may be. The second type of harm is the emotional or spiritual harm. That's when somebody is feeling personally affected by something. Something made them angry or something made them very sad, or they felt like less of a person because of the actions that someone else took upon them. And the final type is like a community harm or a relational harm within the community. So the first one is material. That's pretty straightforward. The second one is really about how they felt and how the harm party has changed because of the experience. And the third one is how the relationship between the responsible party and the community, or the responsible party and the harm party, has shifted or become negative. So those are the 3 main types of harms that we try to explore. Again, virtually every type of harm that's ever come out into conference has fit into one of those 3. In fact, not virtually, literally every type of harm has fit into one of these 3 categories. That's super handy for us because when it comes time to the E part of the Shea Butter acronym, exploring repairs, it gives us a real sense of what sorts of repairs we need to look at for the different types of harms. So a material harm, or an easy way to address the material harm, is by replacing the thing that was damaged. So pay for the broken window, pay for repairs to the laptop, maybe buy them a new sweater. That would address the material harm. Someone had something, they no longer have that something, so let's make sure they have that something again. Emotional harm, 99 times out of 100, an apology is going to help with that. Now, an apology isn't just like, when you were fighting with your sister as a kid and your mom pulled you aside and says, "What did you do? Make sure you say you're sorry." And then you say, "I'm sorry," all sarcastic like, but you didn't really mean it because it was totally her fault. An apology needs to be done well, and it needs to be done effectively, and there are lots of different ways we can do that. Our department has a how to apologize handout that essentially we provide to people when they are committing to an apology letter, and it walks people through various different ways of doing an apology. There's actually a couple of really great videos that I didn't think I'd have time for, so I didn't include them. But if you look at, if you're willing to take a quick note and look up Jonah Hill apology on YouTube, Jonah Hill said something that was really inappropriate, and he goes on a late night talk show and basically says, what I said was unacceptable. This is what was happening, and it hurt me, and so I responded by trying to hurt the other person, and that's not okay, and I'm sorry for what I did. It's actually a very well done apology. On the other hand, take a look at some of the apologies that we see all the time from politicians of every single party. It's always like, I am sorry that people reacted the way that they did. So it's never, oh, I'm sorry that I did that and caused you to feel that way. It's, I'm sorry you felt that way or that you reacted that way. It's really an empty apology, and it's not an apology at all. And a lot of the times it's, I'm sorry that this issue has been found out. So it's not, I'm sorry that I created the issue. It's, I'm sorry that I got caught. Those are not real apologies, and they aren't going to deal with the emotional harm. A real genuine apology can make a huge difference. And actually, pro tip, with your relationship, if you take our Restorative Justice Facilitator Training and you use our apology guidelines the next time you do something awful to your wife or husband, holy cow, does it make things better in a hurry. That's what I've been told. I'm not talking about my own personal experience, I promise. Yes, my tongue is firmly in my cheek. But in all honesty, a good apology can make a huge difference to relationships, and it's a critical skill that I think all of our students need to... Thanks, Catherine. It's a critical experience that I think all of our students can benefit from learning. The third type is our communal harm, and that typically needs some sort of a gesture or project or exercise that can show the community that the perpetrator or responsible party has learned from their behavior and is committing to not do it again. That's part of that rebuilding trust and demonstrating to the community that they aren't going to engage in the kind of behaviors that created the harm to begin with. That can be a program for a floor, that can be, a poster, that can be just addressing the community at a floor meeting or whatever the case may be. There's lots of different ways to address that communal harm, but it basically just needs to be some demonstration of responsibility and commitment to changing behavior. Finally, we get to the agreement stage. Like I said before, we need to remember that restorative justice in the residence context is a discipline process. That means it needs to be effectively documented, and we need to hold people accountable for what they've said they're going to do. So after we've heard everyone tell their stories, we've identified all the harms, we've explored all the repairs, we need to document the agreement, and we need to hold people accountable to that agreement. So if the agreement is that one student is going to write an apology letter, again, it has to be a letter because we want this stuff in writing. If one student says they're going to write an apology letter to another student, what we really need to do is we need to say, okay, you're going to send an apology letter. You're first going to send it to me as a facilitator, and I'm going to review it to find out if it's acceptable. And then you're going to send it to the student. The deadlines for that are this, that, and the other thing. And if those deadlines are not met, this process ends and we deal with your conduct case in a different way. So we need to make sure that we're remembering that the agreement is a critical documentation of exactly what comes next. And if those deadlines aren't met, that student needs to be held accountable in a different way. The reason that's so important is that if we don't keep track of our agreements and if we don't hold students accountable to the agreements that we sign with them, the entire process loses credibility. And if you're working in a residence context, you're not going to be on your own. You're going to need to convince the rest of your unit or the rest of your department or the rest of your campus that this is a thing that can work for you. And if it doesn't have credibility with your students and with the people who go through the process, it's not going to have credibility with the administrators that can empower you to use these tools. It doesn't work on its own. RJ can't be the only way you have of dealing with student conduct. It would be great if it was, but the fact of the matter is that just some people aren't like that. It is our preferred method at the University of Alberta, but a lot of things just simply won't work. So if there's no clearly identifiable harm party, it is really tough to do a restorative solution. It doesn't work with really high-risk situations like I talked about when you have issues of like sexual assault or any sort of violence or anything like that. And it doesn't work if the participants aren't fully willing to engage in the process. So you can tell pretty quickly when a responsible party thinks that they're getting off easy and they're just saying, yeah, I'll do the restorative justice thing. Every single time we've had someone who came in and we thought they might be kind of feeling like that, at the end of it, they have been profoundly impacted and changed by the experience that they've had. And the reason for that is that they're sitting down across from the person that they hurt, and they're being told to their face, like, you hurt me in the following ways. The choices you made hurt me in the following ways. And they always have to be able to take responsibility for that. If they're not willing to take responsibility for the choices they made that caused the harm, then they can't sit down in that room, and we need to deal with that through a different process. So at the University of Alberta, while RJ is our preferred conduct method, we also have a breach of residence agreement process, and that's really simply when we look at the contract that the student signs with us, and we decide whether or not they violated that contract, and if they have, we assign a penalty, either a fine or an eviction or whatever the case may be. Restorative justice language is written into our residence agreement. So that means, like, failure to abide by agreements made by residence life staff is a violation of the residence agreement and can potentially lead to eviction. So if they fail to deal with their restorative agreement in a timely fashion, or fail to meet the requirements of the restorative agreement, that would then be a violation of their lease. So the two processes don't work at the same time, but they do have to work together to make sure that they're effective. Now, in terms of the University of Alberta's example, there are a bunch of different tools that we use to equip our staff with so that they can have restorative solutions. A lot of the stuff I've been talking about so far is the great big conference where you've got all these different people in the room and they're talking about their stories and exploring the harms and all that kind of stuff. Not everything has a conference. You'll remember I said that these big conferences always need to be pre-conference. That means you need to meet with the harm parties, you need to meet with the responsible parties, you need to meet with any support people they want to bring with them, and you need to meet with your facilitator, your co-facilitator, to find out how that's going to go. That takes an awful lot of time. And if all you're dealing with is someone had their stereo up a little bit loud on a Friday night, you probably don't want to invest 40 person hours into investigating, setting up these meetings, doing all these different things just to take it to a conference, when that can really be easily dealt with through a restorative conversation. So we have a bunch of different tools that apply to different levels depending on what the complexity of the situation, a few other factors. The first tool that we have is the primary one that our students and staff used, and that's the community resolution. We use that, and that can go one of two ways. A community resolution can be developmental or it can be restorative. The reason I say that is that sometimes, well, let's use the example of a noise complaint, where we knock on the door as an RA, and the person answers, and the RAs are then trained to say, like, "Hi, how are you doing this evening? Any idea why I'm knocking on your door? Why do you think, do you think your music might be a little bit too loud, or why do you think it's a problem that your music's too loud," and so on and so forth. So they coach the student through a process to understanding that they need to turn their music down and change their behavior. The other way that can go is they knock on the door and they say, "Hey, I'm your RA on call. Why do you think I'm knocking on the door?" And then the student says, "Holy cow, my music is probably way too loud. I'm probably keeping people awake. I'm going to turn it down. Is there anyone I can talk to in a blank and make that right?" And I know that sounds outlandish, but I am telling you from personal experience that once you start using restorative principles, and once people start realizing that they work that the culture of residence supports restorative justice, they really do start doing this stuff on their own. So that would be a community resolution. We record them the same way, but again, they fall on the spectrum somewhere between developmental solutions and restorative solutions. The other thing that can sometimes happen is that the RA can represent the community on a harm party's behalf. So if it's 3 in the morning and you're calling in a noise complaint, you're probably not also wanting to get out of bed, walk up a flight of stairs and have a facilitated conversation with an RA and someone who's playing their music too loud. You just want to get back to sleep. So in that instance, the RA will act as sort of an advocate for the community and say, "Listen, we got a call. So obviously you're affecting somebody. How do you think that might affect them? They had to wake up at 3 in the morning. They might have stuff going on tomorrow," and so on and so forth. So the storytelling piece is done by the RA on behalf of the community members that called it in. That would be a community resolution. The next level is slightly more complex, and that's a restorative meeting. That's when we have a harm party and a responsible party, both willing to participate in the conversation. The RA or the senior RA, or sometimes the residence coordinator, will facilitate a meeting in the moment between those two people, and that's for very simple cases. The best examples of these that we use them all the time for is something like roommate conflicts. The RA usually gets called into a room because two roommates are fighting, and they say, "Go get the RA, we need to talk about it." That would be a restorative meeting. So we train our RAs on facilitation skills so they could facilitate a roommate agreement, essentially, except it's a restorative-based roommate agreement. So a lot of the times in traditional systems, when you have two roommates fighting, the first step is like, okay, we're going to get you two to sit down and fill in an agreement so this behavior changes in the future. But what they don't typically do is deal with the behavior that caused you to have to get involved to begin with. They don't deal with repairing the harms that have already been caused. So by training our staff on how to do restorative meetings, again, specific to the roommate conflict example, we teach them to address the harms that have been caused and set up a plan for moving forward. So it's a much more thorough way of dealing with that. It's not just roommate conflicts, it's also for verbal altercations, it's for uninclusive language, it's for all sorts of different things that we see in residence that traditionally would just be an incident report and then a punishment. The final way we deal with conduct, and the final tool we use, is again the full-fledged restorative conference. This is when we have a harm party, a responsible party. Typically they'll have support persons, so people who know the harm party or the responsible party well, and or maybe they were present for the situation or whatever the case may be. We also typically have a couple of facilitators, and we reserve this tool for complex cases. So this is when we do the full pre-conference, and we meet with everybody, we set up the full restorative circle, we have a restorative script that we follow that takes us through the SHAE process to make sure that the storytelling, harms, repair, exploration, and agreement is all taken care of, and these things are pretty intense. So when I'm hosting a restorative conference, I'll typically try and do my pre-conferencing during the week, and then I'm booking off an entire day on a Sunday to do the full conference. These things can take anywhere between, I've had one where I sat down and before we could get to storytelling, the responsible party said, listen, I am really sorry for what I did. I've been thinking a lot about it. I've probably affected you in the following few ways, and I want to make it right by doing the following 3 things. And the harm party says, wow, I didn't think that's what you were going to say. That's exactly what I want. Thank you for doing that. And the 2 of them left, like, not just on speaking terms, but actually being pretty friendly. So that can happen really, really fast. That took me like 15 minutes. It was a wonderful Sunday. Other times it takes 8 or 9 hours. So they are complex, but with the right facilitation, there's literally nothing you can't do as long as you've got the time to put into it. So as much as we're talking about pretty low-level stuff like roommate conflicts and those kinds of things, we don't use it for sexual misconduct or advanced areas where we could reoffend, but that's not to say it can't be done. A restorative conference is used by other facilitators with more skill in extremely complex cases. And when I say extremely complex cases, I'm not just talking about stuff we see on campus. I'm talking about apartheid in South Africa. I'm talking about Irish and English troubles in Northern Ireland. I'm talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. I'm talking about major things. I'm talking about Rwanda. I mean, if this tool can be used to address harms associated with something as drastic as genocide, I'm pretty sure we can use it to deal with like little Timmy and little Susie not getting along in the residence community. So again, it's very, very scalable. It's extremely complex to do a restorative conference, and it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of time, but that tool is one of the most powerful we can use. We don't use it every time because, again, if it's not commensurate with the harms caused or the responsible parties feeling that way, they feel like it's a waste of time, and again, the process loses credibility. So we want to make sure we're using the right tool for the situation. Of course, we all love our data, and so I pulled some data from 2014-2015 from our report to our Campus Law Review Committee. This would have been year 3, I believe, year 3 or 4 in our restorative process and our use of restorative justice. We went from having almost no compliance on restorative justice to having 87% of our violations resolved restoratively. What that means is it dealt with through a community resolution. There was an apology letter, there was a behavioral agreement, or there was a full restorative agreement. And a restorative agreement can include any of the above things. So a restorative agreement is the outcome of the conference. A CR is an outcome. An apology letter or behavioral agreement, typically those are outcomes of restorative meetings. So that's 87% of our stuff was resolved restoratively, and only 13% was resolved through our breach of residence agreement process. That meant the vast majority of students who engaged in offenses within our residence system were reintegrated into the community and were able to proceed with experiencing residence to its fullest extent and engaging with their peers and that kind of thing. What's particularly interesting to me about this is that when we're talking about our violations and those kinds of things, we actually hit a tipping point really quickly where we weren't getting things recorded because our staff were never involved. Restorative justice, through our cultural change and our returners passing these values on, we would, our REs would report walking around doing their rounds at night, and they would stumble upon restorative meetings happening between students who were having a conflict without a facilitator or with a student at large facilitating. So we actually didn't record everything that happened. Because students just started doing this stuff on their own, which is really, really fantastic. The other thing I find really, really interesting is the recidivism rate. So when we use restorative justice, let me change that up a little bit. When we use our breach of residence agreement process, you've been written up and you've been fined, and you're on your last warning. Okay, that's it, you've been evicted. So you've dealt with the same student 3 different times and they're not changing their behavior to reintegrate into your community. It almost never happens when we use restorative solutions. That year, out of the 2,000 people in my residence hall that we're talking about here, the only people, I'm counting them in my head now as I speak, we only had 4 people who had more than 1 community resolution for the same issue. So, someone might have a community resolution for dirty dishes in their sink, and then like 5 months later, they have another community resolution for making a little bit of noise. Those are 2 very different things, and we don't consider that a pattern of behavior that needs to be addressed. We had very, very few people who actually re-offended in the same way. Once they did a community resolution, a restorative meeting, or a conference, and they understood that, I'm responsible for the actions that I took and the harms that I caused, they actually learned and they never did that stuff again. And that's the overwhelming majority. Like the overwhelming majority of folks that we dealt with were dealt with that way. For the folks who are serial offenders, because they do still exist, so you've got, 1, 2, 3, 4 CRs for 1 student for noise over the course of the first 2 weeks, that student just isn't getting it, so they would be transitioned into a more punitive process, such as our breach of residence agreement process. So again, this stuff doesn't work on its own, but it certainly is effective in the times that we've used it. In terms of opportunities when it comes to restorative justice, I've touched on these throughout the entire session here, but one of the big opportunities that you're going to find in your residence hall is a cultural shift. Again, students just start doing this stuff on their own, and it's a skill building tool for later on. I made a joke earlier about me learning about apologies helps me with my relationships, but that's absolutely true, and we see that within our students as well. It genuinely changes the culture of our residence halls, but moreover, it also changes the culture of our campuses and the way people approach each other. Other Canadian institutions are actually way more advanced in some ways than we are with restorative justice, the obvious example being Dalhousie University. If you're interested, check out the Dalhousie report on they had an issue with their dentistry faculty regarding social media and some very egregious misconduct by members of that community, and they dealt with that through restorative justice. The media was all over it saying these guys are going to get off easy, this is ridiculous, and all these kinds of things. And anyone who could disparage restorative justice had a microphone in front of their face and were saying how this would never work, and people were getting off with a hug and a warning, is what some people were saying. It got to the point that as they were working through the process, there was sort of radio silence from the people involved. But it got to the point where the harmed people in that process published an open letter in various Canadian newspapers that said, hey, back off, we really want to do this, and so far we're finding that it's working and it's doing what we need. Your systems won't do what we need, but this one is. So shut up and let us finish, is essentially what they told everybody. Everybody did. Dalhousie did finish it up, and that was a pretty effective and pretty successful example. So that kind of stuff, actually, you see those advocates coming out in your communities and in your culture, and it causes a cultural shift within your residence hall to genuinely deal with conflict and genuinely deal with misconduct in a really healthy and productive way. Again, it keeps people in the community. I don't like evicting people. I like people staying in my residence hall for as long as possible. I like them being engaged with the community and having the same great experience that countless others have before them. Restorative justice gives people the opportunity to stay in the community, not just as tenants, but as members of that community. I touched on this a little bit earlier, but it really helps the development and the education of our students. Restorative solutions have all the benefits of the developmental approach, so you have students recognizing why behavior is harmful and all those kinds of things. But it also has that piece where the survivors or the harm parties also get the option of learning a bit from the process, and they're able to apply those things later on. And as I mentioned earlier, there's drastically reduced recidivism amongst our students. So that's a huge benefit as well. That data is also backed up, by the way, by the criminal justice system. So restorative justice is used in a very small scale in different criminal justice systems throughout the world. Ireland uses one, Jamaica uses it. There's a few others that use restorative justice for their criminal justice system. Canada has some programs. The programs run in concert with the criminal justice system, and then the outcome of the restorative process is considered when sentencing. So it does reduce the sentencing in the criminal justice system. And again, what we're seeing is drastically reduced recidivism with those people that are involved in those systems. So it's hugely successful, and there's tons of research out there for that. Some of the challenges, it's going to be a drastic paradigm shift for our students. They have spent their entire lives living in an environment where it's all about, it's not what you know, it's what you can prove, to quote our friend Denzel from Training Day. So that's one of the big issues that we find on a regular basis, is this paradigm shift for our students. They really do need to change gear, which is why we start them with it in first year and we keep them with it in second year and so on and so forth. And we shepherd them through our whole system. The other thing I'll mention is it's a drastic paradigm shift for our staff as well. So I'm sitting here telling you all of the virtues of restorative justice. In fact, I'm passionate about this stuff, and I'm so passionate about this stuff I spend my own time volunteering to learn more about it and engage with people to teach them more about it. I was one of the most ardent people against this idea in residence. I was convinced that, if I was a student, I would totally take advantage of this process. This is a bad idea. Deb and Chris, I can't believe you're doing this to me. In fact, I can't believe that I am still friendly with Deb and Chris after how anti-restorative justice I was at the beginning. I have seen the light because I saw it work, and it works extremely well. So it's not only going to be a paradigm shift for your students, it's going to be a paradigm shift for your staff. It's also going to be a paradigm shift for your administration. If I'm like an example of a reformed person, if you will, when it comes to restorative justice on my own campus, keep in mind that people in higher administration roles probably have similar attitudes that I have. They're hopefully very open-minded and willing to entertain these things, but you really do need to make the case that restorative justice works. So your campus environment might be a bit of a challenge for you. There's also that perception out there that RJ is a bit too soft. So we want to make sure that we address that a little bit. And really what it comes down to is just keep going. Keep using it, keep using the tool, developing your processes, and make sure that backup piece is in there as well. So yes, okay, maybe you think restorative justice is too soft. I know that that's not the case. We know through the research that's not the case. We know it's more effective and so on and so forth. If it is too soft, we also still have the punitive process. So that's one of the ways we overcame that challenge. I did promise that I would leave you with some resources. So the first one I would suggest you take a look at is the Little Book of Restorative Justice by a fellow named Howard Zare. It goes into a bit more of the stuff that I'm talking about here today. It's a great read. It's an easy book to read, and it's actually required reading for anyone who participates in the Restorative Justice Facilitators Training here at the University of Alberta. There are tons of different restorative justice resources out there. So hop on Google and you type in just type in restorative justice and the name of your city, and you probably actually have a foundation or association that deals just with RJ in your area. If you are interested, we do host facilitators training every year. It's a shameless plug for my institution, I recognize that, but again, it's more like the Church of RJ for me. I really do believe in this stuff. So it costs a little bit of money to come out. It's really like a cost recovery thing, and we also charge a bit just for the data and the experience and all those kinds of things. We don't have the date set for this year. When we do, we typically send it out on the Northwest NWACUHO listserv, so we'll make sure to do that again this year. So those are some of the resources we have, and again, there are tons of other resources available online. Of course, if you have any further questions or if there's anything that wasn't clear, by all means, you're welcome to contact me afterwards. I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you have. And with that, are there any questions from the group? I'm more than happy to take a look at the questions coming up in the chat box here, or otherwise. So we do have one comment from Laura that says she really likes using RJ as an employer. Student staff are still able to have conflicts, and using elements of RJ has been really helpful in maintaining employee and team morale. And that's absolutely true. So one of the things we have to be careful of is we are a unionized environment, and even though our RAs aren't unionized, we still have to there's certain rules we need to follow. So we cannot use restorative justice to formally address employee behavior. We have to address that according to our collective agreement or whatever the case may be. But we can use RJ practices. So we'll do, you know what, you're getting a letter of warning, but we'd also really like if you were willing to participate in a conference with us so that we can figure out like how we can prevent this from happening again. So the formal process is a letter of warning or a letter of counsel or whatever the case may be. But informally, we use the exact same restorative processes to really repair the harms. The other question is, have I seen RJ used in other capacities outside residence halls? Absolutely. So one of the best videos I've seen in a while. It's a little bit dated now, but it really talks all about the restorative justice's use, and it's called Burning Bridges. And so that was a case where you had 5 or 6 young men who were in a place somewhere. I want to say it was Vermont, but I might be mistaken on the actual location. Anyway, they're goofing around, just being, kids being kids. And this place is very well known for its covered bridges. And anyway, they lit the bridge on fire. And when you look at the facts of the case, they tried to light it on fire 3 times before it finally went up. And then they realized what they had done. So this was a bridge that had a lot of importance to the community. It was, sort of a tourist attraction. It was a local landmark. Those young people went through a criminal process, and they had various penalties that came as a result of that. They, some of them went to jail. They were required to pay for the rebuilding of the bridge, probation, all that kind of stuff. But they also went through a restorative conference, and the documentary Burning Bridges captures the entire conference process. And it really does drive home just how effective this stuff is. Now, when I first saw Burning Bridges, like, whatever, it's a documentary with a bit of an agenda, so maybe that's not as truthful as it could be. And I believed that until I did my first conference, and I saw people having the exact same experience. So that's an example of the restorative conference. You had people's parents there and members of the community and all sorts of other things. It's a really great video, and you could probably look it up on YouTube, to be perfectly honest with you, but that's available. And again, that's called Burning Bridges. Any other questions from the group that I can answer? Okay, I'm not seeing anyone else typing into the chat box. So with that, it's about at our time, and we'll let folks sign off. I'll turn it back over to Alex, and thank you all very much for your attention, and I hope everyone has a fantastic weekend.
Yeah, thank you so much, Craig. We really appreciate it. Of course, if folks do have additional questions, you are more than welcome to reach out to Craig, or you can put those in the chat box below, and I'll make sure that they get to Craig and he can answer them directly to you. So thank you, everyone, for attending today's First Friday webinar. We hope that you have enjoyed your experience and you will consider other First Friday webinars in the future. ironically enough, on every first Friday of the month. Our next webinar is at 10 a.m. Pacific time on Friday, June 3rd. And we are looking to bring you one of our Best of the Northwest presentations from the NWACUHO conference this past February. So if you were not able to attend the conference, we are able to bring those presentations to you. There are several links at the bottom of your screen. One of those is the webinar feedback form. So we invite you to fill out that form so that we can better assess our First Friday webinars and continue to improve the professional development opportunities that we are providing you. We want to make sure that this is the best that it can be. Thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you next month. And at this time, we are going to close out the session. Thank you so much.